Vsauce, Michael here. Was the 1920s woke? And what does it mean to be woke in the 21st century? What does woke mean? To cite the Oxford Wikipedia on words, the word woke refers to when socialist postmodern Marxists try to feminazi LGBT, immigrant leftist abortion rights, and gay. Before I get to the actual video, I just want to make it clear that almost all of what I'm saying stems from Brigitta Soeland's book, Becoming Modern, Young Women and the Reconstruction of Womanhood in the 1920s. So if this topic in particular happens to be of interest to you, I recommend you get the book instead of listening to my half-assed compilation of its contents. And without further ado, let's get to it. Soeland's book is a comprehensive walkthrough in the changes on gender norms that took place during the 1920s. What makes her analysis so interesting is that instead of focusing on the changes in women's position within the labor market or the political rights gained, so voting rights, etc., Soeland focuses on more individual freedoms and ones that took place within the home and the culture at large. Soeland's analysis shows how power can be gained in a lot of other ways than just political. For a lot of young women in the 1920s, it was more central to be able to decide who or where you're allowed to spend your free time with, rather than if you get to vote or not. And this is, of course, not to say that voting rights and right to divorce weren't super central. It's just that, especially for young women of that time, there were also a lot of more everyday issues that influenced them, in addition to being able to, for example, vote. And of course, with the fact that a lot of these young girls were now being employed, working as, for example, secretaries or factory workers, meant that they were sort of getting some income that usually they would then bring back to the home. But because of this employment, they also had some more negotiating power. So now, when they, for example, wanted to go out with friends, they had more sort of a leg to stand on when they tried to argue for these freedoms regarding how they spend their time, since they were also bringing some income into the house. So the earlier research on how women's position changed during the 1920s, so after the First World War, often, of course, focuses on the effect that the war itself had on that time. Now, for example, if you look at Britain during that time, World War One was a great factor in why women started entering the workforce more when most of the men were fighting out in wars, leaving out all the factory jobs for women to fill. Then this, of course, led that when they were now getting a chance to gain some kind of economic independence, they weren't that ready to just give it up when the men came back from the war. But Soerland's analysis is one of Denmark during 1920, and Denmark wasn't really a country that participated in World War One in any significant way. In addition to that, it didn't go through a very rapid industrialization like Britain did during that time. So a lot of those factors you don't see in Denmark, but still a lot of the same end result, meaning a lot of more women would enter the workforce and they would also gain more freedoms in society at large. Soland finds that the changes are instead brought by cultural changes and agency from the young generation striving to distinguish themselves from earlier generations and traditional female roles. She further argues that this wish of becoming a modern generation was created by commercial markets. Most characteristics of being a modern woman are sought through consumption and centered around looks, style, and perception. So then, what was this style of the modern woman during the 1920s? First of all, clothing became a lot more slick and accessible to wear. So the figures of, for example, dresses would be much more streamlined and also easily to, for example, make at home as long as you had the patterns to know how to sew the dress. So they became also a lot more inexpensive to produce and that way much more affordable. which meant that there was less of a gap between the dresses that more upper class would wear and the lower class, which in on itself was a cause for a lot of outrage for a lot of especially men. Dresses and skirts became a lot shorter in order to grant the women wearing these clothes more mobility and granting the ability for them to dress themselves without assistance. This also applies to, for example, lingerie. So instead of these very difficult courses that you needed someone else to put on you, more accessible like bras and stockings were preferred instead. And this same thing applied to hairstyles, which during the 1920s became a lot shorter than in previous times, and they managed to rile up a surprising amount of people. People were pissed off since women were now wearing short hair. And I'll share with you some of my favorite quotes of the absolute controversy that the new hairstyles managed to rile up. In a public lecture, Copenhagen Mayor Ernst Caper, for example, decried that the ideals that define the appearance of almost all women have completely blurred the distinction between professional prostitute and respectable citizen. Another newspaper editor noted that it would be most difficult to respect a woman when she faces us in the attire of a whore. Now, you would have thought that these more streamlined, skin tight, even shorter skirts would have been a cause for male adoration. I mean, more to admire. But instead, it was cause for a lot of resentment in the last half of the 1910s. The new styles, they complained, made women too attractive and too sexy, giving them an unfair edge in the ongoing battle between the sexes in the job market. It absolutely boggles me that somebody in the 1920s would think that women are the ones with an unfair advantage in the job market. With this next quote, I guess I'll have to give out a content warning of it's going to mention sexual assault, which you might wonder, why would a quote about this topic mention sexual assault? Well, some men then claimed that they did not mind that the ladies are dressed like that, but in return, all sections of criminal law pertaining to both rape ought to be abolished. Surely, they argued, women's undressed appearances entail a diminution of male responsibility. They appeal so openly and aggressively to the basest elements in man's nature that it becomes a directly extenuating circumstance if temptation becomes too strong for him. Yeah. These same kind of opinions were also very strongly directed at the newfound fashion in cutting your hair short. Some workplaces openly discriminated against women who adhered to this new fashion. And several prominent department stores did not hire women who supported this new hairstyle. Others fired employees after a visit to the hairdresser. In 1924, the personal director at Grom and Goldschmidt, one of the leading clothing stores in Copenhagen, flatly declared that he would absolutely not engage or employ any young woman with bobbed hair. Also, the president of Solomon David Jr. Inc., Inger Diemer, explained that she had banned bobbed hair. I demand, she continued, that the women who work with us sign a contract that they will not wear short hair. In my mind, that is not proper in an old, highly esteemed firm. Also, the director of Bispebjerg Hospital, Charlotte Monk, banned short hair for all nurses under her supervision. which sounds absolutely silly since shorter hair would probably just be more hygienic, especially in a hospital. Um, but I mean, I guess the nurses still have to look like nurses, so even women in less publicly visible occupations faced ostracism if they chose to adopt the modern style. For example, Inger Mongert worked as a part-time cleaning assistant in a private home in the late 1920s and recalled being dismissed the first day she arrived with short hair. To discourage young women from following this new fashion, newspapers and popular magazines delighted in sensational stories about domestic turmoil caused by short hair. Divorces, physical abuse, family disintegration, and even murders were described as tragic but predictable outcomes of women's changed appearance. Um, so I guess that's some very twisted gay panic defense. Instead of it's just a woman who now has shorter hair, so I guess everything goes. One thing that you have to know is that the ways that womanhood was renegotiated during this time wasn't all super duper liberating and hashtag woke. There were a lot of sexist undertones to it as well. The ways in which women of this time would explain their appearance and the ways in which they were now spending their free time, for example, going out with friends, going out dancing, things that were in previous times considered quite indecent, actually. The ways in which they argued for these things did not stem from, oh, we get to do whatever we want, but more from, oh, us doing these things don't make us undecent. They don't make us public women. So they were still very directly using this good girl, bad girl dichotomy to argue for the right to go and spend time in dancing halls and dressing in the ways that they were choosing to dress. But at no point did they question that, oh, we should definitely moralize these public women who see a lot of men and have just no moral decency whatsoever. So, in a lot of ways, they were just still using these sexist stereotypes just to, like, kind of argue more room for what they felt like doing. So, I feel like it's really important that we understand that ways in which women gain more freedoms and more rights can still sort of feed into more sexist ideas of these are the good women and these are the bad women that we can talk about in a poor way and sort of moralize and consider as somehow less as. And I mean, this doesn't mean that it's bad that these women try to get these freedoms and rights for themselves. It's just that those same strategies can also reinforce the stigmatization of other women. So I feel like it's really important, especially nowadays, that we acknowledge that there's a lot of different kind of women with a lot of different kinds of interests. And so these gained rights and freedoms definitely applied more to women who maybe already had some kind of status, be that they had some kind of economic position, for example, being employed, which gave them better opportunities to argue for more freedoms, which, for example, someone in a working class context didn't have. And you could make this exact same argument for white women having that freedom, but then racialized women who were already more sort of sexualized and stigmatized, still being maybe more likely to be considered these public women's or bad girls. And another really interesting point is that this same dichotomy of good girls and bad girls is something that we can still witness very rampantly going on in the 21st century. Okay, so why tell you all of this? The main point of this video is that people, particularly men, have been upset over how women choose to dress themselves for about 100 years now, at least. There's nothing new about it. In one way or another, gender norms keep renewing themselves, whilst at the same time almost always being in some sort of crisis. You can, for example, now hear a lot about the crisis of masculinity, even though that same masculinity was claimed to be in a sort of crisis almost 200 years ago, back in the 1700s. So it's sort of something that needs to constantly be in a sort of crisis. And I feel like this is an obvious consequence of a set of rules that claims to be stemming from natural instincts, even though it has to reestablish itself as the norm time and time again. I mean, it's quite silly, actually. If there is such a thing as a natural way for women to be, then why do we constantly have to tell them to be that way? I mean, shouldn't it follow that, whether we told them to or not, they would still behave that way if it were, in fact, quote, natural? Now, here's some right wing commentator might claim that it's because of the unnatural influence of left wing politics and contraceptives, which have steered women from their natural path, which, okay. But this also begs the question, why do we even care so much about this supposed naturalness? What purpose does it even serve? An instinct for violent behavior is something that stems from people naturally, yet we deem that to be obviously bad. See, what you have to understand is that these conservatives have already decided, consciously or not, that women should be, in one way or another, subservient. They should take care of children or take care of the home whilst men go out and support the family. They've already decided that this is the kind of world they want to live in. And this whole naturalness argument is just something that they throw on top of it in order to make it seem more legitimate. And for whatever reason, it works. But what you have to understand is that oftentimes a conservative worldview does not start with someone critically looking at the status quo and thinking, I don't know if this is how we should do things. Often it stems from a very emotion based feeling that this is how things should remain because it feels safe and it feels secure. And because suggested changes in social systems, in political systems, feels scary, it feels threatening, and it feels like you're messing with something without knowing what the full consequences is. Conservatism is one opting for a feeling of safety. And then this means that it's not some kind of super rational end result of deeply philosophically pondering, at least not oftentimes. Sure, there'll be some exceptions of philosophers being conservatives, but most aren't. And this is one of the main reasons why conservatism is so underwritten about in political philosophy, because a lot of the political philosophers just won't be conservative, so they don't really care to talk about it. And so, what you have to understand is that most conservatives have already decided that they're right, and then after that, they look for the arguments. And this is usually a very different approach that we think that people's political views stem from. We think, oh, first they look at the world, they do some thinking, and they make some conclusions, and then that's where their whole political view will stem from. So when you look at arguments made from a conservative perspective, you have to understand that the way in which they come to those arguments is not one of first come the arguments and then come the conclusion, but instead they start from the conclusion and then work backwards to try and find good arguments for it. So when you try to look at, for example, this naturalness argument, you should not think, oh, well, how does it then naturally follow from this that this is the way the world should be? No, it's the other way around. And I know that this is never going to be something that a person with conservative views is gonna confess to you. And my own hypothesis is that in a lot of times when somebody comes to a conservative worldview, it's not this very conscious choice. It's something that happens very unconsciously in all of us because it's a very understandable instinct to opt for that which feels safe, that which feels familiar. But just because something is familiar doesn't mean that it's the best option out there. So, what are then the main conclusions of this video? Well, gender in one way or another is always going to be in crisis. The whole concept of gender norms stemming from natural instinct in on itself is very silly because why do we then always have to keep telling people to act that way if it's just natural? And thirdly, you should look at conservative arguments very critically and understand that they don't always follow this rationalist logical, oh, first we look at arguments and then we come to conclusions, but instead start from the conclusions and only then start to look for arguments. So, I mean, I guess end result is stay critical.
Cut my life into pieces. This is my last resort. Suffocation, no breathing. Don't give a f if I cut my arm, please.